Hi, I'm Mark Madison, and I'd like to welcome you to another in our series of Conservationists in Action out here at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, where we have an opportunity to interview scientists, authors, and other distinguished conservationists who are coming through oftentimes to give public lectures. Today, we have a real treat. We have somebody on who we've had on before. Dr. Stephen Potter has returned. He was out here about a year ago talking about some of the local American Indian tribes out here, and he's returned again. We had such a good time with him. We lured him back, and before we kick off his discussion of buffalo in the East, a tale of pigs, people, and pigeons, let me give you a little background on Dr. Potter. He is the Regional Archeologist for the National Capital Region of the National Park Service, which includes over 88,000 acres of parkland in portions of Virginia, Maryland, District of Columbia, and of course Arkansas and West Virginia here. In 1993, he published Commoners, Tribute, and Chiefs, The Development of Algonquin Culture in the Potomac Valley. He's a very incredibly knowledgeable person about everything from American Indians to the Civil War to the reappearance and disappearance of wildlife in our part of the country. So we're very excited to have you back again, Stephen. It's a pleasure to have you back.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Great.
It's fun to come back.
Your title was Buffalo in the East. I think you should tell the audience what you had for lunch today at NCTC.
I thought Mark had arranged this. I had buffalo burger. Actually, it was a buffalo meatloaf or bison meatloaf for my lunch, and I thought for sure he'd arranged that ahead of time.
I wish we had, but we have it on the menu quite often here, and we happened to be eating lunch with my wife, and she commented, like I imagine a lot of people would be thinking, she didn't know there were buffalo in the East. That was new to her, and she wondered when they'd been here, how they'd gotten here, and kind of their history, and I think that's the purpose of your talk. So let me let you kick it off.
Oh, absolutely. Well, this tale of buffalo in the East, to most folks, begins with the DeSoto entrada into the American Southeast between 1539 and 1543. DeSoto might be considered in 21st century terms a venture capitalist, having made, though, most of his capital on preying on the destruction of other Native American cultures further to the south, particularly in South America. So he became very wealthy, very young, and he convinced the King of Spain that he was going to hire a private army and come into what is now the American Southeast and see if he couldn't do a repeat performance of what had been done by some of his contemporaries before him in Mexico and South America, thinking that at the very least there had to be silver, if not gold, and I want to be the first to find it. So he brings 600 men, 300 horses, war dogs, unknown number of camp followers, and a swineherd with him. Potentially, by the time he gets to the Mississippi, up to around 300 of them. And while folks previously had thought that it was the two-legged critters, the Spaniards themselves, who may have introduced diseases that affected the native populations and caused the collapse of these very large chiefdoms, very politically complex groups with thousands upon thousands of citizens making up some of the chiefdoms. It's more likely that it was the swineherd that followed his men, the porcine cloud that was his mobile meat locker that provided the kicker and ultimately the destruction of the Native American cultures in the Southeast. Zoonotic diseases are very interesting. I don't claim to be a zoologist or someone whose specialty is that, but I have read on them. And it's fascinating to me where the leap can go from a microbe that affects an animal to humans. And we've had this come about in our own times very, very recently with the big scare just several years back. Avian influenza becomes human influenza. Bovine, cow, rinderpest becomes human measles. That one flipped me out when I first learned that one, having had measles as a young boy.
Yeah.
Horsepox becomes smallpox. And of course, smallpox was extremely deadly to Native Americans. It wiped out the Mandan for all intents and purposes as we started to move up into the plains. And of course, we have the pig. And the pig had been the mainstay of European agriculture for quite a long time. They can transmit to humans brucellosis, leptospirosis, anthrax, trichinosis, and of course tuberculosis. And then of course there is swine flu. We've all heard of that.
Yeah, yes, much in the news.
Much in the news. And so it's quite likely that the extensive depopulation that occurred remarkably quickly after 1543, which is finally when the remnants of De Soto's private army managed to slog their way through from Arkansas into Louisiana down to the Texas coast. By that point, De Soto himself was dead. He died on the banks of the Mississippi, and his men buried him apparently so that no one could ever find him, probably knowing full well that the Mississippi, being what it is, was going to very quickly take him someplace else or either cover him up. What's interesting is the extent of the depopulation and how quickly it did occur. In this area of the lower Mississippi, below the Ohio all the way down to its mouth, the folks who survived the De Soto Entrada remarked that when they got to the banks of the Mississippi, they could see nothing but these fortified towns up and down it. And that usually from the palisaded wall of one, they could see 2 or 3 others. It was incredibly dense. In 1682, René Robert Chevalier Sieur de la Salle came down the Mississippi. And for 200 miles, they didn't see a single settlement. And this was the same area that De Soto in 1541, 1542 had seen this incredible density of American Indian settlements. So right there, that should give you a sense of just the extent of the depopulation that occurred. And it's that reduction in the key species, us, that presented the opportunity for bison or buffalo to re-enter the southeastern United States.
Yes.
Now, I mentioned that earlier, science and knowledge is always advancing, and that's a good thing because it'd be very boring otherwise. And I just discovered a few weeks ago some research that had been done by R. Bruce McMillan, who, interestingly enough, was a PhD candidate at the University of Missouri, at Columbia, Missouri, when I was starting as an undergraduate in American anthropology and archaeology. And he is in Illinois, and he had been looking for some years to try and find archaeological evidence of bison in southern Illinois. And they have now finally confirmed archaeologically the presence of bison. And the bison they had recovered would date very nicely with the decline of Cahokia. Cahokia was this huge city. It may not have been filled with urbanites, but it was a population of around 14,000 to 15,000 people living just south of what is now East St. Louis, Illinois, in the American Bottoms. And it was in 1200 AD at its height, with a population of 14,000 to 15,000, it was larger than London at the same time. Wow. And this huge population wasn't just there in the American Bottoms. There were suburbs, if you will. And at the height of Cahokia, it's very interesting because they didn't want bison running around on that side of the Mississippi particularly, wreaks havoc on your cornfields, and given to have this density of people in this kind of a concentrated space at 1200 AD, they had to depend on their maize. Right. So bison and maize don't mix. And so they did everything they could to sort of keep the bison out. And then with the collapse of Cahokia, around 1250 AD, a little later, it presented an opportunity for bison to at least cross the Mississippi and become perhaps a little bit more common in what would become the prairies of southern Illinois. So it's not out of the question that that could have occurred earlier. They now think that they actually have evidence of bison as early as 400 AD in southern Illinois. Still, that wouldn't surprise me until you get to the rise of Cahokia, and then once you have that period of time between 900 AD and around 1250 AD when Cahokia becomes a major settlement area and focus of American Indian development, it's likely that their populations would have waned again. So while you might have had bison east of the Mississippi in the area around southern Illinois, you would not have, though, in the lower Mississippi, certainly below the Ohio, as things changed, and whereas the power base had been in the area around St. Louis and East St. Louis in what is called the early part of the late woodland period from 900 to around 1250 AD. After about 1350, 1400, the pendulum swings to the south, and it's the lower Mississippi that things take off, and that's where you get the development of these major chiefdoms, which are political units of hierarchical power. It's like a pyramid, and you have a primary leader at the top, and then you have layers, at least two beneath that individual, that rules groups down to the local village level. And they were very politically sophisticated. When DeSoto was moving through the southeast, they were actually able to field armies of several thousand Indians against him at some points. There were actual pitched battles in a couple of instances. But unfortunately, Spanish steel and horses always won the day. And if DeSoto wasn't anything, he was audacious, to say the least. So we get the people. It's probably not the people, it's probably the pigs. The pigs then do the number, and the bison re-enter the southeastern United States sometime after 1543. The date usually given by is circa 1550. You start having bison re-entering the southeastern United States, and they start going up the major valleys. So the same routes that American colonists and settlers would use to come to the first west of the Appalachians, are the very routes that the bison are going to use to feed themselves into the interior eastern woodlands of the United States. They represent an early outbreak population, an ecosystem that is now out of balance because the key species has been taken out. Another indication of this disruption to the ecology comes about as a result of the American passenger pigeon, the other outbreak population, hence the pigs, people, and now we get to the pigeons. Right. And it's incredible what happened there. I've got a quote that I dearly love. In the early 19th century, you have people like John James Audubon, who sees the American passenger pigeon as one of the prime examples of the Garden of Eden, the natural abundance of America. And I love this quote. This is Audubon. "The air," he wrote, "was literally filled with pigeons. The light of noonday was obscured as by an eclipse. When he visited the roost of these pigeons, dung lay almost 2 inches deep for miles." Here comes the full quote. Yes, it certainly is. "The pigeons, arriving by thousands, alighted everywhere, one above another, until solid masses as large as hogshead were formed on the branches all around. Here and there the perches gave way under the weight with a crash, and falling to the ground, destroyed hundreds of the birds beneath, forcing down the dense groups with every stick was loaded. It was a scene of uproar and confusion. I found it quite useless to speak over the roar of the wings, or even to shout to those persons who were nearest to me." Since I'm staying in the Aldo Leopold Lodge, in 1947, he dedicated a monument to the passenger pigeon near the site of its greatest recorded nesting, at which hunters slaughtered 1.5 million birds. The plaque read, quote, "This species became extinct through the avarice and thoughtlessness of man," end quote. The pigeon should indeed stand as a rebuke and a warning, but if my colleagues as archaeologists are right, it should not be thought of as a symbol of wilderness abundance. The passenger pigeons were as much an outbreak population as the bison or the buffalo. And prior to European contact, the population of passenger pigeons was small due to human and other wildlife competition, because the humans and wildlife needed the mast as much as passenger pigeons enjoy gobbling it down as fast as they can stuff it down their gullets. And of course, by mast, we're talking tree nuts and things like hickory nuts, beech nuts, acorns, butternuts, hazelnuts, pecans, walnuts, and chestnuts.
Chestnuts back then.
All things that American Indians used. Those were the mainstays that particularly got them through the winter and into the following spring, from which they made a variety of things. And of course, they were competing with things like deer, turkey, and raccoons for that same mast. So they didn't need a third competitor with the avaricious and ungodly table manners of passenger pigeons. And so since people and animals such as deer, raccoons, and turkey were going for the mast as well, that competition kept down the American passenger pigeon population. And also the fact that these other animals, two-legged and four, were taking up space to boot. You remove the key species again, not only do you open the door for bison to re-enter the southeastern United States, but suddenly your competitors are gone, particularly if, as a result of the pigs introducing these diseases through turkeys and whitetail, their populations may have been affected as well, not simply the humans. Yeah. And suddenly, the passenger pigeons are just giving carte blanche, and they can just gorge themselves and reproduce until the cows come home.
Nothing else ate them or hunted the passenger pigeons?
It's interesting because it was an archaeologist who first looked into this whole thing, and they studied 7 different archaeological sites that had incredible collections, including faunal remains. And we know it's not differential preservation in the archaeological record, because these sites produced very, very small bones and fish scales. So there's no question but that had American passenger pigeon bones been there, and there were over 70 odd different species of bird bones identified in these assemblages, if they were there, they would have been preserved to the same degree of preservation as all the other bird bones and the smaller bones, such as mice and other rodents and fish scales. Well, they were there, but in less than 0.1% of the total assemblage. So they were on the landscape. And surely if they had been there in sufficient numbers, the Indians wouldn't have passed up an easy meal, because while the American passenger pigeon may have been known as the blue meteor for its grace in flight and its speed, in all other ways it was dumber than a fence post and very easy to kill, particularly the squabs. Yeah. And so no, apparently they really weren't. Now, after they had become so prolific in the late 18th century, there's this incredible account written by whites of Iroquoian peoples just gorging themselves silly on these things because a roost had come in close to where their villages were, and there was so much to be had that even the village dogs reached the point of having had their full of pigeon meat. So
that doesn't happen that often.
No, it doesn't.
Hey, before we move on, the Leopold quote you said was near the site of perhaps the largest
documented roosting.
Was that in Wisconsin or Michigan?
Yes,
Wisconsin?
yes, that was in Wisconsin.
Just
yep.
Those who might not be as familiar with Leopold as we are. One other thing worth pointing out to our viewers, because we have, in addition to Park Service folks, Fish and Wildlife Service folks, and BIA folks, is those that aren't cognizant of the newest work in archaeology, it's really become a hotbed of environmental history, recreating past environments. It always had been, but I think those of us that work in niches like environmental history or ecology don't realize the wealth of information that comes about through archaeological discoveries and a way to recreate these past histories. We might be more familiar with things like paleobotany and stuff like that, but in pollen analysis and that.
Yes.
But it's archaeology where the human impact on the environment really has been documented. And this is really an interesting build-off of some of the stuff we've read from Tim Flannery and some of these other folks about early extinctions, or you got kind of the opposite story, early eruptions.
Yes. And I'm proud as an archaeologist to say that it was an archaeologist that first came up with this idea and then did this particular study to see if the archaeological data backed up his hypothesis. So I think it's interesting. And just a quick sidebar here, not that I'm here to do a plug for James D. Rice, but James Rice, environmental historian at SUNY Plattsburgh, has a marvelous book out called Nature and History in Potomac Country, From Hunter-Gatherers to the Age of Jefferson. And he uses quite a bit of archaeological evidence that I and my colleagues have gathered in the Potomac Valley as well as in the Chesapeake Bay region. And I was very excited to see that, where you have environmental historians who are now discovering the wealth of data that they can use as grist for their own mills to reconstruct environmental histories back further than the written record. And so that excites me a great deal.
Me too. Well, I interrupted your narrative. We've got exploding pigeons.
Pigeons. So there's just an example of how it wasn't simply bison or buffalo as an outbreak population, but the American passenger pigeon too, and that's why I thought, not only because of the alliteration, but because that's the other thing that people lament is, you know, the loss of the American passenger pigeon. And so I thought it would be a nice juxtaposition there, that particularly with the archaeologist having done the study, and this just sort of fits hand in glove with the fact that, yes, with the collapse of the key species in the southeast, you have opportunities for more than simply bison. You have other populations that were outbreak populations too. Some of the early accounts of the eastern bison are very interesting because they were not exactly after a period of time. By the time that you get into the early 18th century, there apparently was some differentiation in the population to be able to visually discriminate an eastern bison from its western cousin. Here we've got a marvelous quote from Mark Katz, the British naturalist who was in the southeast in the 1720s. And the quote goes, "In winter their whole body is covered with long shagged hair, which in summer falls off, and the skin appears black and wrinkled, except the head, which retains the hair all the year. On the forehead of a bull the hair is a foot long, thick, frizzled, of a dusky black color. The length of his hair hanging over their eyes impedes their flight, and is frequently the cause of their own destruction. When wounded, they are very furious, which cautions the Indians how they attack them in open savannas, where no trees are to screen themselves from their fury. Their hooves, more than their horns, are their offensive weapons, and whatever opposes them are in no small danger of being trampled into the earth." Later, just a few years later, we have William Byrd. Byrd is, along with the Virginia commissioners and the North Carolinians, trying to define the dividing line to separate Virginia from North Carolina. And near the end of his journey into the interior, literally where he's almost beginning to get into, he's in the Piedmont, but he is starting to see the Appalachians in what would now be modern-day Stokes County, North Carolina. They encounter their first and only buffalo, although they'd seen plenty of buffalo sign in the terms of their spoor and their tracks. A little wide of this creek, one of the men had the luck to meet with a young buffalo of 2 years old. It was a bull which, notwithstanding he was no older, was as big as an ordinary ox. His legs are very thick, and he are wide and short, and his hoofs exceeding broad. His back rose into a kind of bunch a little above the shoulders, the hump, which I believe contributes not a little to that creature's enormous strength. His body is vastly deep from the shoulders to the brisket, sometimes 6 feet in those that are full grown. The portly figure of this animal is disgraced by a shabby little tail, not above 12 inches long. This he cocks up on end whenever he's in a passion, and instead of lowing or bellowing, grunts with no better grace than a hog. The eastern bison would probably be more like the Canadian wood bison, although the ones we have today, unfortunately, were interbred with the American plains bison, and so they're not exactly 100% in terms of their original genetic stock through apparently some mishap that happened in the early 20th century. But they wouldn't have been as long from nose to tail as their western cousins. They apparently stood a little taller at the hump, from hoof to hump, and they were more of a blackish brown than they were a buff or tawny brown. So there would be such a thing then as an eastern wood bison. And
were they more solitary than the
yes, and they're although they still had herds, but the biggest herds that we can reliably document based on the person making the account, who you always have to take that into account. Are they someone who is prone to hyperbole or not? Probably around several hundred to 500. There are those who claim they saw herds of 1,000, but I think that's probably stretching it. But 3 to 5 would not have been out of the question, but smaller droves were far more common. The interesting thing is that it was the bison traces that ultimately provided the means for the colonists, first after Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, when the groups that had been the buffer groups along the fall lines of the major rivers here in the east, they gave up that area in the Piedmont, allowing the settling of the Piedmont. And then when you had the Treaty of Albany in 1722, that further opened up more expansion from the Piedmont and then over into the Great Valley, whether you were in Maryland, Virginia, or for that matter in Pennsylvania, because a lot of people don't understand it, but in essence the Shenandoah extends all the way up to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and it's all one Great Valley. And at that point, of course, you run into the French and Indian War. And only those that were truly foolhardy would have tried to have penetrated past the mountains at that point until the French and Indian War has been settled. And then you get the 1763 proclamation. And that's where the British are going to keep all their colonists hugging the coastline on the Atlantic, and they're not going to let them go over the Appalachians into the Ohio country and into Kentucky and what is now Tennessee. Well, if you're poor, if you're up to your neck in debt, and if your prospects of getting more land are slim, a proclamation isn't going to stop you.
No.
And of course, that was the whole problem.
Right.
And that's where you get into this period of the long hunters. And the long hunter, short definition, is a professional hide hunter. And probably one of the most famous of these who got into it through the back door is Daniel Boone, who, by the way, hated coonskin caps. He thought they were uncivilized.
Where did that myth come from? Disney?
Probably. And then, of course, well, actually, Disney portrayed Davy Crockett.
Davy Crockett, right.
Who, of course, preferred to be called David Crockett, not Davy.
Right.
And he, too, would never wear a coonskin cap. He wore, it was more like whatever they were wearing during the era of Charles Dickens in Great Britain is what they were wearing. I'm not kidding. They may have had on a hunting frock, but they were not wearing coonskin caps. And so Daniel Boone's coonskin cap came from the television series. And just throw that one out the door, folks. That whole thing, trust me, Boonesboro never looked like it did on television. We're going to get into that a little bit. They've been mythologized because you've had, James Fenimore Cooper's leather stocking hero, Natty Bumppo, a.k.a. Hawkeye. But getting right down to the brass tacks, the Long Hunters broke treaties and laws to trespass on what were supposed to be Indian lands by the proclamation of 1763 and by the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1768, as well as by Virginia statutes. Okay. They just didn't care. They just went west. Most of them despised their native peers as either foes or competitors because they were out there to get hides. And the hides they were most after were white-tailed deer. Elk and buffalo hides are too big and bulky. And once you get all these hides, you've got to traipse them back east so you can turn them into cash money or land or barter or whatever you want to do. And so it was deer hides they were after. They adopted Indian skills and the trappings of Indian dress, but they also supplanted the Indians as middlemen in the trade, which was another threat to the American Indians. Yeah. Not only are these guys trespassing on our lands, not only are they killing our deer and eating our buffalo, which they called their wild cattle, by the way, which I thought was pretty interesting. I like that. Nice analogy. And their elk. But they're, taking literally the things that we could have gotten in trade away from us. They're taking the meat that could sustain our families through the winter and the buffalo hide that could serve to keep us warm in the winter. And they're using the hides themselves while they're there locally, but they're not traipsing them back east with them. And they're taking all these deerskin hides back east. So most long hunters were plain, poor men seeking land and relief from debt. That's the bottom line. And it was also a way for them to try and feed hungry mouths back home. This brings us then to Daniel Boone, who's the quintessential long hunter. He was broke and in debt, living on the Yadkin River in North Carolina. A gentleman by the name of John Finley had known Boone 14 years earlier because Boone had been a teamster on the wagons that provided the logistics for Braddock's ill-fated march to the Battle of the Monongahela. Boone is one of those who cut his traces and ran. He was no fool. So he's living on the Yadkin in North Carolina, and John Finley comes up to him, and he asks Boone if he wants to see Kentucky. Well, boy, did he. So Boone, along with 5 other men, including Finley, and his younger brother, Squire Boone, go into Kentucky, and they built a station. The station was a structure called a half face, where it's logs on 3 sides, but it's the roof is at an angle like this, kind of like a shed roof. It's open on one face, which is why it's called a half face. And for 7 months, they literally lived off the fat of the land. Venison, buffalo tongues, buffalo humps, buffalo marrow, and they're taking whitetails like crazy. This will give you a good example. Well, Shawnee captured them. They let Boone and the other 5 go. They confiscated, this was great, 13 horses, bales of fur, and over 900 deerskins.
Wow.
The Shawnee leader was Will Emery, and he warned Boone to stay out of their land and to, quote, leave their cattle alone, end quote. He did give the 5 men 1 French fusil, powder, balls, and 2 pairs of moccasins each to see them back east. Now, think of it at the same time. If he had committed this sin in jolly old England, he would have been hung. Yeah. And here he has broken treaties, broken Virginia colonial statutes. So he's broken 2 treaties. Virginia, he's trespassing on Indian lands, and
he's given moccasins, told to go home.
Yeah, and at least a fusil so that they have something to get themselves to eat. And so he's given his life and say, get back home, don't come back again. Well, he didn't listen. He returned again And they passed through Cumberland Gap on their way back from another successful hunt. So at least they got to Cumberland Gap, got through it this time. They got on the east side of Cumberland Gap. They ran into a band of Cherokees who didn't take kindly to what they had just done. Once again, confiscated all the deer hides that they had gathered over a period of months, the horses, the whole 9 yards, and Boone is left penniless once again. And so the third time around, of course, is when he then leads a party to try and settle Kentucky under Richard Henderson, who has set up this illegal country called Transylvania, which means beyond the mountains. And so that was an interesting event in and of itself, and that's where you have the famous mural that was just done recently by David Wright that hangs at Cumberland Gap National Historic Site of Boone leading this very idealized group of folks through the gap into Kentucky. You know, from an Indian perspective, I think that mural, if it were painted by one of them, would look entirely different. The wilderness road that they established follows buffalo traces. Matter of fact, most of the early roads into what would become Tennessee and Kentucky were based on buffalo traces. And so the buffalo traces served as the conduit to unfortunately pump more people into the area where the greatest density of eastern buffalo were. And so we talked about the long hunters. Well, now we get to the other two groups, the meat getters, I love that expression, and the
no need to ask
hunters.
what that means.
Yes, and it's really interesting. The meat getters were the people that when you finally got to Kentucky, there wasn't enough time and it was very backbreaking to get crops in, to start your corn and to sustain yourself off of agriculture. So you're starting from scratch. What the thing that is going to keep you and your family going until such time as you can start clearing the land and putting in crops to help sustain yourself? Buffalo. Because an adult male buffalo will bring in at least live weight 2,000 pounds, some of them up to 2,400.
It's amazing.
Yes. So think of all that meat on the hoof from one buffalo. So that was part of the draw for bringing settlers from the more settled east through the Appalachians and the Alleghenies to the other side, is that once you got over there, the game was so plentiful and you could get so much off of a single buffalo that just you could live off a buffalo alone until you had established yourself. Yeah. So imagine then the effect that that had. Well, the American Revolution put the brakes on everything because the American Revolution was fought on the frontier, meaning the other side of the Alleghenies and the Appalachians was a whole nother kettle of fish compared to the way it was fought, more according to European styles, the guerrilla warfare in the southeast notwithstanding. And it was just open woodland warfare to the max. It was as bad as anything that was seen during the French and Indian War, and in most cases worse. And while that did deter a lot of people from going west at that point, and some left the area because it was too exposed, it was too dangerous, it didn't take long once the revolution was over for that vacuum to suddenly get filled back up again. And that's when all bets were off because, well, hey, the Brits are out, the American colonies are in, so forget the proclamation of 1763, forget the Treaty of Fort Stanwix of 1768. Hey, it's a whole new ball game we're moving in. And that's where things go off the scale. And it's interesting because Kentucky became the 15th state in 1792, and that's not that many years. The Treaty of Ghent ending the American Revolution was in 1783, so you got 9 years later, boom, here you have it. And the official opening of the Wilderness Road occurred just a year or so later. And at that point then, the floodgates were open. And so the first people coming in there, still trying to get established, were looking for folks that could provide them a means of doing so. And so the meat getters were the way of doing it. And even in the early days when they set up their first stations, which would later become towns, or the forts, Boonesboro probably being the first fort in Kentucky, although not the first town. Harrodstown has that honor. That the meat getters were the ones who would go out, get the buffalo meat, and bring it back and try and sustain these settlements or these clusters of concentrated populations of the first settlers west of the Appalachians and the Alleghenies. And then we have the market hunters. And they were there all along. The French were the first biggies, and they were actually taking bateaux laden with buffalo meat from the Illinois country held by the French before the French and Indian War, and from places like Fort Deschartres, going down to New Orleans, and that was their main market. And so you actually
had a long journey.
Yes, you did. But I mean, they would literally have thousands upon thousands upon thousands of pounds of buffalo meat that they were transporting down to New Orleans. And even the first of the market hunters into Kentucky were trying to figure out a way to perhaps sell what they were getting rather than trying to bring it back over the mountains. Wasn't there an easier way to get to the Mississippi and go down and sell it in New Orleans rather than try and bring it back to the east? And so for a long time, even before the French and Indian War, you had market hunters among the French and among some of the renegade English colonists who'd come over the Appalachians and the Alleghenies, and they were slaughtering the animals strictly for the meat to provide to the New Orleans market. And of course, as things opened up, they then started to ship them the other way as more caravans came through. That's another myth that also needs to be busted, is the picture of the long hunter out there on their own two legs. Listen to that first event where Boone goes into Kentucky the very first time. What do the Shawnee get along with the 900 plus deer skins? 13 horses. How are you going to transport, if you're a long hunter and a professional hide hunter, all those hides on your back? I don't think so. Yeah. So the horses were pack horses. And so of course they went in, west of the Alleghenies and the Appalachians on horseback, very rarely on foot. So to me, that's another interesting thing. Last but not least, we've got some quotes. One other quote here I'd like to share with folks. It's written in dialect, and it's pretty amusing to me.
Always the hardest quotes to read.
Always the hardest quotes to read. And this will take us as the segue to all this stuff in front of us and behind us. This was written by a meat getter by the name of Daniel Trabeau. And he's on the Green River in Kentucky, and it's the year 1778. And with his party of native Virginians who came originally from the Tidewater, and they're called Tuckahoe, so that's the period name. So when you hear Tuckahoe, think Virginian, was a quarrelsome young Irishman. One of the men we had with us was a young Irishman who was constant contending and disputing with the other young men that was from old Virginia about words and customs. So sometime that morning I shot a buffalo bull and he fell down. We all went up to him. Some of the men had never seen one before this one. I soon discovered I had shot this buffalo too high, and I told some of the boys to shoot him again. This young Irishman said no, he would kill him, and jumped at him, which meant that he ran at him very quickly with his tomahawk and began striking him in the forehead. I told him it would not do. He could not hurt him. The wool and mud and skin and skull was all so thick it would not do. He kept up his licks a knocking away. The buffalo jumped up. The man run. The buffalo after him. It was open woods, no bushes, and the way this young Irishman run was rather descending ground. And every jump he cried out, "Oh Lord, oh Lord, oh Lord, oh Lord." The buffalo was close to his heels. The man jumped behind a beech tree. The buffalo fell down, his head against the tree. The Tuckahoe boys laughing, ha, ha, ha. One of them went up and shot the buffalo again and killed him. The Irishman exclaimed against them, saying this was no laughing matter, but that these boys, or young men, he said, was such fools that they would laugh if the buffalo had killed him. These young men would mimic him, oh Lord, and break out in big laughter. The Irishman said he would go no further with such fools. I advised him to take a load of this buffalo meat, and it was very fat, and he was welcome to it, to which he agreed, as we did not need it. We took a little of it and bid him adieu.
That's a great story. So thanks for telling us how not to kill a buffalo.
Yes, you don't want
What
to
type
use
of axe?
one of these. This is a British trade pipe tomahawk. It was made between the time of the American Revolution and the War of 1812, and it's the real deal, and it was quite a skull buster.
Yeah.
Now, if that Irishman had tried to do it with this, I might have given him a little bit more credit, although I still wouldn't want to have gone after a buffalo with this.
Right.
For all the very reasons that Daniel Trebout very cogently observed. And this, by the way, you can smoke it. There is a hole that goes all the way through it. And so, in this particular one, there is a cake of tobacco in here. It actually was smoked historically. This is more likely what our young Irishman would have been using. This is a frontiersman belt axe. Why? Because you don't want a lot of weight on you. You want to cut down on the weight. This is an old haft of hickory. It's not necessarily the original, because I'm sure this thing, through its history, went through multiple halves. And you even have the blacksmith's touch mark here, which is in the shape of a heart and an H.
Oh, yeah.
And this is called a hammer pawl tomahawk, or a frontiersman's belt axe. And you can even see where it was last worn. There's hardly any wear on this face, and there's a great deal of wear, so it would have been worn in the belt on the side like that.
Very nice.
This is a frontiersman's knife. It's a curly maple handle. This is pewter, holding in a steel blade that most likely is from something recycled. My guess, probably from a file. Most knives that were made on the frontier were made by blacksmiths who would reshape the metal and would use it for something else. And this is the real deal, also from the late 18th century. And then to get to the things that the long hunters, meat getters, and market hunters would have used, we'll go to some of these. And we'll start with this. This was certainly put together in America, whether it was by a German who was with Hessian Rifle Company, or whether it was by some of the riflesmiths that were in the Winchester area, which is where this came from, Winchester, Virginia. This is made on the style of a German military Jaeger, which is the kind of rifle that was used by Hessian rifle companies during the American Revolution. This particular one, I can tell you, was made sometime from 1777 until the end of the war. Why do I know this? Well, it's because of the types of ramrod pipes here. Okay. These are not only from off of a British firearm, but they're a particular style called the Pratt style of ramrod pipes. And this particular style was not put on British arms that were used here during the American Revolution until 1777. The lock and the trigger guard and the butt plate and the side plate are all come off of a French, probably a French officer's fusil. The barrel was made for this stock, and it's a hand-forged barrel that is swamped. What that means is you've got a wide breech. The barrel then tapers about right here where it's the narrowest, and then it flares out again at the muzzle. This thing was like carrying around a portable cannon. It was
about the same weight.
60 caliber. Oh, it's not that heavy at all. It's 60 caliber. And this was the kind of thing that some of the long hunters and the meat getters would favor for a host of reasons. It's a huge bore. Yep. If it hit something, it would certainly louse up their day. It might not kill them outright in the first shot, but hopefully they were a good enough hunter that it would. And of course it was short barreled, so it might make it somewhat easier, both on horseback and going through the cane breaks in Kentucky and those kinds of things to move around with it. However, it did require huge lead balls. which meant that you had a lot more weight for
Yeah.
a fewer number of balls. It also meant you had to pack a lot more powder to push that 60
the heavy
caliber
ball.
ball out of here. So you have the rise of the American long rifle. And
Wow.
this is one that was made in Maryland. It was made in the 1790s, but is similar to the ones that would have been used in the 1770s and 1780s. There would be subtle differences that if you're a Kentucky rifle freak like I am, you would be able to say, yes, I know this is not from the 1770s or 1780s, but it's from the decade of the 90s. It has what's called a patch box, which is actually, in this particular case, probably was used to carry greased patches. There is some residue that's still in here, and you can actually feel it, where you would take a cloth patch and you would use that to wrap around the round ball so that it would fit tight in the rifling. This particular one has 7 furrows and 7 lands, continuing the agricultural analogy.
Yeah.
Some people will say lands and grooves. It should, following the 18th century terminology, be lands and furrows. The furrows being the grooves, and of course they're cut in a spiral. It's very lightweight. You can see that even though this thing probably weighs in at 12 pounds, I can hold it at the rear sight with an open palm, and you know,
Nicely balanced.
it's extremely nicely balanced. This one is 42 caliber. Why an odd caliber, you say?
Why an odd caliber, Stephen?
Because you want to shoot a 40 caliber round ball. So the 2/100ths of an inch difference is for the pillow ticking or the cloth or whatever you're using to envelop the round ball. So that they would oftentimes make them on an odd caliber so that you would wind up with something like a 40 caliber or a 45, which is usually considered more standard. But this is the kind of thing that a long hunter would have carried, and this is a tool. It's not a weapon. Yes, you can defend yourself with it, and yes, you can use it offensively as well. But it is a tool. It's the thing that put meat on the table. It's the thing that got you hides that you could use to also feed mouths and put meat on the table. And if you were lucky, maybe get you some specie or coinage so that you could perhaps purchase some land. I'm not being redundant here. You're going to say, well, Stephen, why are you showing me another long rifle?
Why are you?
Well, it's not.
Looks like the one you just showed us.
It does, doesn't it? It's even longer than that one. And it has a patch box. And it also has a cheek piece, which is another of the defining characteristics of an American long rifle. And this one has a tapered barrel. So why isn't it an American long rifle? It's because they didn't rifle it. It's what's called a smooth rifle. And this one, it has no rifling, no lands and furrows in the barrel at all. And it was purposely made that way.
Why didn't they rifle it?
If you were going to own one gun, if all you could afford was one gun, you wanted it to be as versatile as possible. And in this particular case, you could shoot a patched round ball out of this. It wouldn't be as accurate because it's not rifled, so that means it's not going to have a spin to the ball, so it's not going to have a flatter trajectory and go further and shoot more accurately. However, a patched round ball in this, and that's why it's got a rear sight, is going to do probably a little better than a musket, but you can also put shot in it. And you can also use buckshot in it. So buckshot is roughly 30, 32 caliber, small little teeny round balls. So you could actually load it with buckshot, or you could load it with shot. So you could take small game, large game, and if you're in the eastern woodlands, chances are you're not going to be shooting at anything that's, and try and hit to kill more than 75 yards away anyway.
True.
Maybe 100. You might be taking a risk if you tried to bring down something at 100 yards with this, but who knows? If you got good enough with it, you could. So this is something that, even using the terminology of the time, was referred to as a smooth rifle. It has all the characteristics of an American long rifle except for the rifled barrel. So if you were going to go into Kentucky and you could only afford one gun, this would be the one you wanted.
Stephen, where did these gorgeous artifacts come from?
I happen to have been fortunate enough to acquire them over a number of years. So they're from my own personal collection.
Thank you so much for sharing them with us. Did we talk about the horn?
That's a good segue, because you need this to feed this. Last myth. Myth is that with these horns, and this is an 18th century rifleman's horn, it's been carved down into the horn. This is called engrailment. You also have this nice scalloped effect on the butt end of the horn. And this is late 18th century Virginia. And oftentimes you will see two horns carried with a flintlock rifle. A smaller horn that supposedly had fine-grained powder that you would use to put in the pan, so that when you were going to fire this critter, you would first, of course, load the main charge in here. So you would pour powder in the barrel, then you would take your patched round ball and ram it home using your ramrod.
Right.
And then once it was seated on the powder charge here in the chamber, you would then take, the story goes, your smaller horn with the priming powder, put it in here, put your steel or frizzen down on top, take it from half cock, put it to full cock, and the weapon or gun would now be ready to fire. And then when you squeeze the trigger, this would come down. It would throw the frizzen forward. The steel would rake, the flint would rake against the back of the steel, throwing a shower of sparks onto the powder in the pan. There would be a swoosh from the explosion here, sending a spark into the main chamber, and then the explosion in here, and the gases would push the patch ball out, and away you go. There was literally, I've fired these things, some people call them flinch locks, because people would have a tendency to flinch having an explosion literally this far from their nose. And aside from that, once you got past seeing an explosion in front of your face and you became accustomed to using this tool, it was an extremely accurate weapon, particularly the rifled ones. Well, turns out that on the frontier, no, they weren't carrying two horns. They were carrying a single horn. You didn't have the luxury of wanting to be able to do all this nonsense of, well, let me get my priming horn and put this in here and da-da-da-da-da. It turns out that for rifle guns to begin with, they used what is called double F powder. Triple F and 4F are coarser grains, so the finest is 1F. That's usually what would go in the little priming horns. Those come later, especially into the 19th century, and they're using them maybe for pistols also. But on the frontier, your long hunters, the meat getters, the market hunters, they're just using one powder horn and probably carrying double F powder that was used in both the pan to prime the piece, as well as in the barrel itself to fill the chamber to shoot and make the ball exit. So,
Stephen, we've gone through an hour. It's gone incredibly fast because of these amazing artifacts you've brought and the great story you've told us about wildlife we thought we knew, like bison, which is prominent on our Department of Interior flag, among other things, and passenger pigeons, of which many of our famous conservationists have written eulogies to, and so on. Thanks for helping set us straight and making us more aware of the environment. I'd like to thank everybody who took the time to tune in to another in our monthly series. I hope you enjoyed this and you understand why we've had Stephen back twice now and hope to lure him back again. And we hope you'll tune in the next time we have a Conservationists in Action series.